California Governor Gavin Newsom has lost his mind, and he is suggesting a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to limit your gun rights.
Every time, it's the same. They tell us we can't stop these massacres. They tell us we have to stand by and watch tragedy after tragedy unfold in our communities. They say we can't stop domestic terrorism without violating the Second Amendment, and that thoughts and prayers are the best we can do. I'm here to say that's a lie. So today, I'm proposing the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution to do just that. The 28th Amendment permanently enshrines 4 additions to the laws of our land. It raises the minimum age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21. Because if you can't buy a beer, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun. It mandates universal background checks to prevent truly dangerous people from purchasing a gun that can be used in a crime. It institutes reasonable waiting periods for all gun purchases, and it bans civilians from buying assault rifles, those weapons of war our founding fathers never foresaw.
We'll talk about that in just a minute, but first, super secret giveaway going on. It's happening right now. It's absolutely free, but it ends really soon. So click the link in the description down below to see what you could win. Here's a hint. Gavin Newsom is trying to restrict it. So yes, Gavin Newsom trying to remain relevant and get himself into the spotlight since his budget crisis in California is ballooning out of control. He's got a $32 billion deficit with the budget that he's proposing in California. They're talking about things like fiscal cliff and all sorts of other stuff. So in order to get the spotlight off of his terrible budgeting problem, he decides to stand in front of the cameras and say, we need an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to restrict gun rights for Americans. This 28th Amendment wants to change the ownership age of firearms, the age at which you can buy a firearm, from 18 to 21, wants to ban assault weapons. I'm actually going to read this in just a minute there. The way he describes assault weapons are just crazy. He wants to mandate universal background checks, and he wants to institute what he calls a reasonable waiting period. When you put the word reasonable in a government document, that means there's no definition, and unreasonable politicians can do whatever they want. So, yes, he's out there jumping up and down saying we need a constitutional amendment, and he says this one will actually augment the Second Amendment, not infringe upon it. Again, lost his mind. If you're doing things and saying things that infringe upon the Second Amendment, you can't just say, no, they don't infringe. Honest, we're just changing the laws to make guns more difficult to own, but it's not infringing upon the Second Amendment. So this is just a political stunt, but the problem with this is that the more outrageous the claim, so he makes this crazy outrageous claim, then when people come in with a little bit less outrageous claim, they think, well, it's not as crazy as what Gavin Newsom said last week, and it might happen. This is part of the philosophy of eroding the Second Amendment, and anti-gun folks continue to talk about this, and they continue to make wilder and wilder claims and requests, and then they can chip away at the rules and at our freedoms a little bit at a time, because the thing that they're taking away from us isn't as crazy as what they just said before. So Gavin Newsom has shown time and time again he is no friend to firearms and firearms owners. This guy is just out there on the fringe, raising the federal minimum age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21. That's one of the elements he wants. Mandating universal background checks to prevent truly dangerous people from purchasing a gun could be used in a crime. You know, if Gavin Newsom isn't going down into the worst neighborhoods in Los Angeles and just taking back all the guns that people have illegally there, he shouldn't be coming after the guns owned by law-abiding citizens. He wants to institute a reasonable waiting period for all gun purchases. What's reasonable? Is it 10 days? Remember at the height of the pandemic in California, where people were lined up around the block at gun stores, going inside only to find out that California had this 10-day waiting period and they couldn't get a gun anyway. And they're like, what do you mean I can't buy a gun? So What is a reasonable waiting period, Governor Newsom? Is it more than 10 days that we have to wait before we can protect ourselves? I don't think that's right at all. And then, listen to this. I'm reading it right off the screen. Barring civilian purchase of assault weapons that serve no other purpose than to kill as many people as possible in a short amount of time. Weapons of war our nation's founders never foresaw. I love it when people make this argument because you know what? Our nation's founders never foresaw the use of computers. So when they wrote the First Amendment, does the First Amendment no longer apply to computers? We can't have freedom of speech over the airwaves. They didn't think about radio or television or anything like that. When our founders wrote the Second Amendment, they specifically included all of the weapons that the military was using. Yeah, they happened to be using muskets at the time. The landowners, the farmers, the people who fought the revolution in the United States were using, they owned, they kept at their houses, they carried with them the same weapons that were carried by soldiers. The only thing they didn't really have was cannons, but nobody talked about that because it was difficult to get one made and haul it around. But when we're talking about the small arms that were used by the military at the time of this writing, they weren't writing it for that specific date, time, and location. That's not what they were talking about. They were talking about the freedom of the people in this country to own firearms to defend themselves and, if needed, defend themselves against a tyrannical government. So this whole case that, well, our founding fathers never foresaw that. There's so much that our founding fathers didn't foresee or couldn't foresee. That's why they wrote the amendments to the Constitution the way they are. For someone to say that this no longer applies because the technology has changed, well, that would mean that the First Amendment no longer applies because the technology has changed. The Fourth Amendment no longer applies because the technology has changed. The Fifth Amendment no longer applies because the technology has changed. That's simply not true. The amendments are not about the technology, they're about the concept of freedom. When Gavin Newsom puts this forward, talking about a constitutional amendment, you know it's not going to happen. He's not going to get 2/3 of the states to ratify this constitutional amendment. But he can be out there making a spectacle of himself so that people don't look at the other stuff he's messing up. And that's just Politics 101. He needs to take the spotlight off of himself because he's got so many other problems going on in his state. But once he starts talking about gun control, and notice he doesn't call it gun control, he calls it gun safety. Well, I want to know how many gun safety classes Gavin Newsom has put out for the people of California. Are there official state gun safety classes that teach people how to handle guns safely? They're funded by the state of California. They're funding everything else. They got a $32 billion budget deficit. They're funding everything else. Let's have them actually fund gun safety classes and see if that helps them with gun safety issues. And when it comes to crime, they're not going to the worst places in the worst cities to arrest people for buying a gun without a background check or a waiting period. It doesn't happen in places like East LA or Compton or anything like that. That's not what's going on there in California. These laws only apply to the law-abiding citizens, the people who will follow the laws as written. Criminals don't do that. That's why gun laws don't help reduce crime. And an amendment to the Constitution, just plain silly. We want to make sure that we stop this stuff. I don't think it's going to happen, but we need to be aware when politicians do this because they're eroding our rights and we've got to stop them. Before you go, you just missed one of our best videos that got over 500,000 views. Click right here to watch it now.